So in class, we've been discussing the achievement gap and the discipline gap and looking at the various factors that contribute to the racial disproportionality in schools and how all of this is linked to the school-to-prison pipeline. In the article, The Achievement Gap and the Discipline Gap, Two Sides of the Same Coin, Gregory, Skiba, and Noguera looked at how these gaps are connected, specifically examining differential behavior, differential selection, and differential processing. The racial disparity is often explained by saying that youth of color are more deviant and they have more inappropriate behavior, and that that's the reason that these gaps exist, when really it's been found that this disparity isn't due to their behavior, but rather things that work against them, like differential selection and processing. Gregory, Skiba, and Noguera discuss on an institutional level that students of color are kept under more surveillance, they're subjected to more racial profiling and biased sentencing, and they have these negative outcomes towards these students. They also discuss how the discrimination that occurs in the courts and correctional systems leads to an overrepresentation of minorities in these systems. The racial disproportionality in discipline has been demonstrated in Lawson and Skiba's Suspended Education, Urban Middle Schools in Crisis, where they found that black students were 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students. These suspension rates have long-term repercussions, such as leading to dropping out of school. A big problem with the unequal rates of suspension is that we have certain groups of students who are missing class or are more likely to miss class because of these suspensions, and in turn lose important learning time. The suspension stories we watched on YouTube show youth of color telling their stories and how it was hard for them to get caught up on schoolwork when they came back because of everything they missed. Gregory, Skiba, and Noguera also found a positive correlation between time engaged in learning and student achievement. So if these contributing factors are taking class time away from minority students, it's obviously going to be reflected by lower achievement and therefore show a gap in school achievement. So taking all of this in, we add in the fact that people have become accustomed to this kind of occurrence, that people have made up their minds about the way certain groups and races of students act. Gregory, Nygreen, and Moran discuss that this trend of trying to weed out the bad kids and the patterns that apparently show who these bad kids typically are has led to a normalization of failure. So not only do we have things like differential selection and differential processing leading to gaps in achievement and discipline, now we have this mindset where failure for youth of color is normal. This reinforces the gaps because we have an acceptance of the kind of kid who fits the mold. We have come to expect that youth of color are going to fail or get in trouble so much that it's normal. It doesn't seem surprising, and people don't try to fix it because they think that it's just the way things are. If this is seen as normal, people will continue to act in these ways that reinforce the gaps and disparities. Not only this, but eventually the minority groups come to see it as normal too. They come to see themselves as failures because they have all these things working against them, and it's considered natural. So when I was reading these articles over again, I wrote down 3 words that to me sort of grasped the problems that I was consistently seeing. One of the words was ignorance, and that our institutions look at the students to blame for their failure rather than taking into account other factors such as school discipline strategy and outside factors. It also seems like there isn't a lot of change trying to happen. They seem to just ignore the problem, which in the end just ends up reinforcing it. Another word was subjectivity, especially in the normalization of failure article. It seemed that there was a lot of emphasis placed on the teachers and administration in schools to do what they saw was right, again without taking into account a lot of other factors. The third word was endurance. These schools would create these programs to attack these problems happening in the school, and they would see them working, but then there was a lack of maintenance and organization to keep the new initiatives going, so they would just eventually dissipate. So these ideas are even more relevant when we focus in on particular populations that are more susceptible to the school-to-prison pipeline and all of the previously discussed contributing factors to low achievement. Burdge, Licona, and Hyemingway discuss how school-based conditions force certain students out of school and create a school push-out. They looked at how schools have hostile environments for specifically LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth of color, with high rates of harassment. The research also shows that LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth of color deal with increased surveillance and policing, relatively greater incidence of harsh school discipline, and consistent blame for their own victimization. So, drawing on the normalization of failure and the marginalization of certain groups of students, we can look at intersectionality coming into play to further reinforce disparities among achievement and discipline. Again, our institutions have this idea that we have to separate the good kids from the bad kids to create a better learning environment. But it's not fair that due to reasons such as stereotyping and labeling, it's become normal to view what Dr. Miners referred to marginalized groups as dispensable in the eyes of our schools. The more these kids appear to be against the apparent norm of success, the further they fall into failure and the stronger the school-to-prison pipeline becomes.